Good afternoon. My name is Allison Kaplan. I'm Director of Education for the National First Ladies Library, located at First Ladies, a National Historic Site here in dreary today, Canton, Ohio. We have just opened our new exhibition, Beyond Camelot, The Life of Legacy of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. And if you didn't get to hang with us here the past few days for the festivities, hopefully you can make it out in person soon. And if not, we have a number of really amazing programs for you to connect with to learn a little bit more about Jacqueline Kennedy. I'll tell you about those, and then we will transition to today's event. So if you are local to us or you are traveling, our summer hours for National Park Service have just debuted. So please check those out. You can go to firstladies.org to find out more info, or to our partner site to find out about visiting our site and seeing the exhibition. We also have a number of special tours that we're planning. So you can come on May 18th for a champagne tour led by a curator. And we'll have a number of those once a month throughout the run of the exhibition. If you are connecting with us virtual and you're still interested in chatting with me and you haven't gotten tired of me yet, I would recommend on the 16th, we're going to have our film discussion with Stark Library. We're going to be watching Southside with me on Canopy. So that's the really fun dramatization of the Obama's love story. You can learn about how they went and had Baskin Robbins and saw Do the Right Thing and Kissed on a Rock in Chicago. So that should be really fun. And then on the 30th, we're going to jump right back into First Lady fiction, and we're reading a novel, Jackie and Me, which is really fun. It's a newer book about a friend of Jack Kennedy's, a gay man, and his relationship with Jackie Kennedy. So I think that one should be great. And then we have a number of children's programs. June 17th, our first Fun with Flotus program is going to debut here in person. And we'll also continue to have a virtual component of that. So without further ado, I want to let you know a few housekeeping things. First of all, the chat is open. So if you want to share where you're tuning in from, if you visited the site, if you're going to come see Beyond Camelot, please let me know. If you have questions for our speaker today, you can post them in the Q&A or you can put them in the chat. And lastly, just housekeeping, if you are having AV issues, I did want to let you know that we are going to be sharing this out to anybody who registered. If you're like me, you might register for things on Eventbrite and then totally forget about it, or be on the run and watching it on your phone, and the signal's not quite working. So we will send you a link to this recording afterwards, or if you just want to share it with a friend, that's totally fine. My other recommendation is if you logged in through Eventbrite, click out so you open Zoom. It's just a much better experience. We've had a lot of people have problems with sound, but I'm not an AV whiz, but I know a lot of my attendees are, so they are happy to help too. So without further ado, I want to tell you about today's speaker. Dr. Kimberly Chrisman-Campbell is an award-winning fashion historian, curator, and journalist based in Los Angeles. She is the author of so many interesting sounding books. Let me tell you about them. Fashion Victims Dress at the Court of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Worn on This Day, The Clothes That Made History, The Way We Wed, A Global History of Wedding Fashion, and the book she'll be discussing today, Red, White, and Blue on the Runway, the 1968 White House Fashion Show and the Politics of American Style, printed by my own school of choice, Kent State University Press in 2022, and also Skirts, which you can see in the background behind her today, Fashioning Modern Femininity in the 20th Century. She's written about fashion, art, and culture for The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Political, Slate, and The Wall Street Journal, and has appeared on NPR, Biography Channel, and Reels, along with several podcasts. She was a 2020 to 2021 NEH Public Scholar and USC Libraries Fellow. As well as writing books and articles, she does writing, lecturing, curating, and consulting for museums, universities, and the entertainment industry. So I want to welcome Kimberly, and I'm going to turn things over to her.
Well, thank you, and hello from sunny Los Angeles. It's great to be with you to talk about the only fashion show ever held in the White House. Now, if this is news to you, you're not alone. It was news to me, and I'm a fashion historian. I didn't know about this until I came across a very brief mention in an interview with a designer who had attended the show and thought, oh, maybe I should look into that. So I did, and now it's a book. I'm going to share my screen with you so we can look at some pretty slides instead of looking at me the whole time. This historic 1968 event has been virtually forgotten today. At the time, it received extensive and glowing coverage in the fashion press, with some journalists even predicting that a fashion show would become an annual event on the Capitol's calendar. But records, photos, and artifacts preserved in the Lyndon B. Johnson Presidential Library and other museums and archives offer clues as to why the first White House fashion show was also the last. The cautionary tale about the risks and rewards of mixing fashion and politics. Surprisingly, it was not the famously fashionable First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, the subject of the library's new exhibit, who brought 7th Avenue to Pennsylvania Avenue. Instead, it was her successor, Lady Bird Johnson, a woman who never expected or aspired to become First Lady and struggled to live up to Jackie's immense popularity and stylish example. The lunchtime show was conceived as a joint boost to America's garment industry and Johnson's pet cause, the Discover America program to promote domestic tourism and conservation. The show was pointedly titled How to Discover America in Style. While fashion and the National Park Service may seem like strange bedfellows, both benefited from the post-war impetus to celebrate the United States as not just equal to, but better than Europe, and keep America's spending money in America, a task given renewed urgency by the country's unpopular involvement in Vietnam. The New York Times somewhat cynically called the event as patriotic as the 4th of July, as wholesome as apple pie, and as promotional as a TV commercial. Let's start by taking a look at the show as most Americans experienced it, through a Navy Films newsreel. Well, the newsreel is a lot of fun. I particularly enjoy hearing Lady Bird pronounce both governors and west with 2 syllables. But it doesn't give a very complete or indeed accurate picture of the event. It's carefully edited for maximum glamour and patriotism. The show's most obviously patriotic element was its palette of red, white, and blue garments. Virtually all of the press images, from the photo call on the White House lawn to the behind-the-scenes snapshots to the newsreel, featured those ensembles, even if they were published in black and white. This color scheme was echoed in the table decorations, centerpieces, menus, and programs. Everything was tremendously red, white, and blue, the Los Angeles Times observed. Of course, that particular color combination didn't have much to do with what was happening in American fashion at that time, or indeed any time apart from perhaps the bicentennial of 1976. The event's organizers clearly struggled to find enough red, white, and blue garments to fill the runway. This section of the show, more than any other, relied on inexpensive, youth-oriented sportswear labels rather than prestigious 7th Avenue designers. While many of the guests wore red, white, and blue, they stuck to 1 or 2 of the colors rather than wearing them all at once. The First Lady wore a knee-length white wool dress, whose designer she diplomatically refused to name, with navy patent leather shoes. First daughter Lyndon Johnson Robb wore a navy blue Jeffrey Bean coat dress. Bean had designed Linda's wedding gown just a few months earlier. And on the left, you see Lady Bird laughing as she was introduced to Mrs. Robb for the first time. But almost all the guests at the luncheon flew the flag, symbolically, if not literally, wearing American designers. Now, as a major television personality, newscaster Nancy Dickerson, on the right, instinctively knew that the way to stand out in a room full of red, white, and blue clothes made in the USA is to wear yellow French couture, an Andre Carrez suit. Lady Bird wasn't an avid follower of fashion, and I doubt she spotted this sartorial treason, but I still love this picture because she does not look amused. Ironically, it was Dickerson who had first cooked up the idea of showcasing American fashion in the White House with Mrs. Johnson's social secretary, Bess Abel. Dickerson, seen here conspicuously decked in red, white, and blue for an interview with LBJ, was the first female CBS news correspondent, a mainstay of best dressed lists, and a Johnson family friend. On August 16, 1966, she sent Bess Abel a newspaper article about the Council of Fashion Designers of America, founded 4 years previously by New York fashion publicist Eleanor Lambert. In her accompanying letter, preserved in the LBJ library, Dickerson referred to this group as the one we talked about when we discussed a possible fashion show at the White House. I still think that's a great idea and that you ought to reinstigate it. From her personal and public viewpoint, I think this would be great for Mrs. Johnson. She added, and wouldn't it drive Women's Wear Daily nuts? The First Lady had just banned Women's Wear Daily from covering her daughter Lucy's wedding after its reporters broke into the bridal gown designer's premises and published an unauthorized advance sketch. Just over a month later, Dickerson contacted Mrs. Johnson directly, writing, since it is a general consensus that American designers have now caught up with, and perhaps this year overtaken the Parisian haute couture, why wouldn't it be a good idea to give American designers some sort of recognition with a White House setting? As you know, the American fashion business is our 5th largest industry. Yet the idea languished for another year and a half. Dickerson was not alone in trying to persuade Mrs. Johnson to show more interest in fashion, which the First Lady dismissed as, quote, frou-frou. Fashion shows were a regular fixture on social calendars of the late 1960s, usually hosted by women's groups to benefit a particular charity or cause. The invitations to fashion shows that Mrs. Johnson and her daughters received and invariably declined fill a 2-inch thick file folder in the LBJ Library's archive. They came from a bewildering variety of benevolent organizations, including the Naval Officers' Wives Club, the Potomac chapter of the National Society of Interior Designers, the Texas-Colorado Lakes Council of Girl Scouts, the Darlington Parent-Teacher Association of Harford County, the Faculty Wives of Glassboro State College, and the Women's Auxiliary of the American Dental Association. But that's not to say the First Lady didn't enjoy fashion. She was simply too busy to accept every invitation she received and could not accept one without offending someone else. In a few cases where the cause was politically sensitive or close to her heart, she agreed to act as patron of the fashion show without actually attending. And she regularly offered fashion show organizers framed signed etchings of the White House to use as door prizes. Rare unedited newsreel footage shows the multitasking Mrs. Johnson enjoying an in-flight fashion show on a chartered plane to California in September 1966, which happened to include several red, white, and blue garments. At one point, a model opens her white jacket to reveal a red, white, and blue striped top, causing the First Lady to laugh and clap her hands in delight. Let's watch this unedited newsreel with no sound on. Okay, here comes the big reveal. In February of 1968, Mrs. Johnson finally gave in. By this time, fashion had grown to be the fourth largest industry in the US, employing 1.4 million Americans, more than 80% of them women. With the midwinter meeting of the National Governors Conference in Washington, D.C. approaching, the First Lady issued invitations and handwritten White House security passes for a leap day luncheon and presentation of spring fashions to entertain the governor's wives. Also on the guest list were Second Lady Muriel Humphrey, the wives of President Johnson's cabinet members, and a who's who of American fashion designers and editors, including Rudy Gernreich, the inventor of the topless bikini or monokini, who preserved these in his archive. Though the idea of staging a fashion show at the White House had now been in the air for at least a couple of years, it came together in a mere 2 weeks, a feat only the power of the presidency could have pulled off. Sheaves of memos, lists, and seating charts preserved in the LBJ library testify to both the complexity of the logistics and the collective anxiety over getting it right. Mrs. Johnson and her small staff, seen here, handled the logistics, sourcing mirrors, ironing boards, lights, makeup tables, garment racks, and everything else needed to stage a New York-style fashion show in the White House. It was, as the Chicago Tribune reported, an event more complicated than a military maneuver, a metaphor that had added weight at the time of the Vietnam conflict. The fashion side of the event fell to a committee chaired by Harper's Bazaar editor Nancy White, a presidential appointee to the National Council on the Arts, and consisting of fellow appointee Eleanor Lambert on the left, and 3 Washington-based fashion editors, Eleni Epstein of the Washington Star, and Nina Hyde and Dorothy LeSueur of the Washington Post. Together, they selected 85 outfits by approximately 50 designers, along with hats, shoes, jewelry, and props, and arranged for everything to be delivered from New York to Washington in a White House van. I'm sorry I can't show you a bigger picture of the committee posing with the First Lady on the right. Although many official photos were taken, the negatives have been lost, and several of the images I'm going to show you are thumbnails from black and white contact sheets or screen grabs from unedited newsreel footage. A week before the show was to take place, the Washington Post hinted that the White House and the committee had conflicting agendas, with the First Lady pushing for affordable clothes that were wearable, not weird, and the committee focused on promoting elite American designers, most of them Eleanor Lambert's clients or Harper's Bazaar advertisers. As Mrs. Johnson's assistant for beautification and conservation, Sharon Francis, remembered, she was thinking of the fashion show as a way to showcase good-looking, outdoorsy clothes. That, of course, was not where the fashion industry was investing its creative talent. Props like suitcases, cameras, sunglasses, umbrellas, and binoculars emphasized the travel theme more than the clothes themselves. On the runway and in the audience, superstars like Bill Blass, Jeffrey Bean, and Donald Brooks, the so-called 3Bs of 7th Avenue, rubbed shoulders with inexpensive sportswear brands like Mr. Mort, Ginori, Originella, and Sportwhirl. The First Lady may have also insisted on including the red, white, and blue clothes, perhaps inspired by her in-flight entertainment, as well as inviting some of her own favorite designers. Fellow Texan John Moore had made her 1965 inaugural gown and matching sable-trimmed coat. Greek-American designer George Stavropoulos dressed her for her official White House portrait by Elizabeth Shumatoff, as well as several evening events. Roxanne Kamenstein, the designer for Samuel Winston, made this beaded white gown Mrs. Johnson wore to the inaugural gala and numerous state dinners. Molly Parnis and Adele Simpson provided the day dresses, suits, and dress and jacket ensembles that made up the First Lady's daily wardrobe, as well as some evening gowns like this one by Parnis, now in Texas Tech University's collection. Though hardly American fashion royalty, these designers made the cut, while the likes of Bonnie Cashin, Norman Norell, and Kennedy favorite Oleg Cassini did not. Eleanor Lambert took a much different approach 5 years later, when she organized the landmark Versailles 73 fashion show, an equally patriotic but far more glamorous affair, pitting 5 top American designers against their Parisian counterparts in the Royal Theatre at the Palace of Versailles. In many ways, the White House fashion show was a dry run for that far more famous event. Great care was taken with the seating chart, especially for the First Lady's table. Bess Abel sent Mrs. Johnson an annotated list for her approval, describing designer Pauline Trégère as bright and entertaining, and 36-year-old Oscar de la Renta as a charming, delightful young designer. You will like him. Because there was no budget for the show, many of the planners and participants donated their time and services, including 12 $150 a day models from New York's Mannequin Agency. 6 designers also lent their salaried in-house models at no charge. A few local models filled the rest of the spots, some of them moonlighting college and high school students. All the models had to undergo background checks. They were told to bring robes, slippers, and hairpieces. Hairdressers were provided, all of them men, but the models did their own makeup. As one of them told me, the Secret Service had their hands full searching our bags between hairpieces and lingerie. I think after a while, they just started to reach in without looking. While most of the designers and guests have passed away, many of the models are still alive. And I'm so grateful to them for sharing their memories of what for many of them was a career highlight. Although for others, it was just another day at the office. Fittings and alterations had taken place in the Lincoln bedroom the previous day, followed by rehearsals lasting well into the night, and a full dress rehearsal on the morning of the show, as you can see in the large photo here. Just imagine 26 fashion models running around the second floor of the White House in their robes, while downstairs the busy schedule of meetings, receptions, and ceremonies continued as usual. China Machado, a stunning half Chinese, half Portuguese ex-model, turned Harper's Bazaar editor, remembered that she spent the day running around the White House getting the models through their fittings in her standard working uniform of a black top with black pants and a black scarf, worrying that the Secret Service would mistake her for a Viet Cong infiltrator. By the time the fittings and rehearsals finished at 3 a.m., Machado was so tired that she simply crashed on the bed in the Lincoln bedroom among the racks of clothes rather than returning to her hotel. Though all the models and clothes arrived safely, a last-minute blizzard kept several of the invited designers grounded in New York, throwing the carefully planned seating chart into disarray. Jeffrey Bean, Adele Simpson, and Oscar de la Renta were left stranded. Among those who made it were Pauline Trégère, Chester Weinberg, Casper, John Moore, George Strophopoulos, Molly Parnas, William Trevia, and Rudy Gernreich, who watched his model swither down the runway from a front row seat. You can see him at far right. Gernreich didn't just save his invitation and other souvenirs, but the actual Pierre Cardin Nehru jacket he wore on his visit to the White House. While President Johnson made an appearance at the luncheon, drawing a standing ovation from the audience, he skipped the runway, saying he was going upstairs to take a nap. Before the show, Mrs. Johnson posed for an awkward photo op on the White House lawn. The 5'6", 55-year-old First Lady couldn't help looking short and frumpy next to the tall, mini-skirted models. China Machado remembered that Mrs. Johnson's assistant came running to her just as the guests were due to arrive and said, "Who knows how to tie a scarf?" The scarf in question was this Discover America scarf, which all the guests took home as party favors. Frankie Welch would design more than 4,000 scarves during her fashion career, many of them with political themes. But this was only her second effort. Mrs. Johnson's social secretary and press secretary were friends of Frankie's and customers of her Alexandria boutique, and it was probably their idea to commission Welch to design the red, white, and blue souvenir. The 22-inch scarf featured an abstract map of the continental United States with the Great Lakes in blue and the words Discover America in red and white. Welch and a small army of volunteers screen printed 120 of them in under 3 weeks. The Los Angeles Times reported that some were scarcely dry on the day of the show. Models in the show wore the scarves as well as hats and umbrellas covered with the design, and they were later mass-produced and sold in national parks gift shops as well as department stores. The White House ordered several to be given as gifts to visiting dignitaries and female foreign journalists. Welch designed a second rectangular version of the scarf made up of 8-inch square repeats, as well as skirts and dresses using yardage printed with the Discover America design, worn by Welch at Wright. 39 governors' wives attended the fashion show, though there were some notable absences among the Republicans. Both Nancy Reagan and Leonora Romney declined the invitation. After an all-American luncheon of consomme White House, chicken curry Columbus, green salad, and peppermint ice cream with chocolate sauce, 26 models walked the white-carpeted 600-foot runway erected for the occasion in the gold and white state dining room, as the U.S. Marine Band played in an adjoining foyer. Far from the jazzy lounge music of the newsreel, the playlist reinforced the Discover America theme, with songs like Chicago, Oklahoma, and I Left My Heart in San Francisco. The half-hour presentation of 85 outfits and was narrated by Nancy White, the Harper's Bazaar editor who wore a blue suit with a white hat and a red carnation in her lapel. That's her in the background. She began by thanking the First Lady, saying, "Everyone involved in American fashion and the art of it and in the economics of it, from the designer to manufacturer, from store president to model, feels personal pride and boundless gratitude for the honor you have bestowed on us today. Already the impact and significance of this occasion has become the proud property of the whole world of fashion." Behind the runway, slides of American tourist destinations like the Grand Canyon, the Golden Gate Bridge, the Statue of Liberty, and Mount Rushmore, flashed on a rear projection screen. The Chicago Tribune claimed that these were Lady Bird's own slides, but they were actually supplied by the Department of the Interior. The error is telling, however. The entire event was pitched as a homespun affair, born of the First Lady's patriotic love of America the Beautiful, and emphatically not a flashy publicity gambit by New York fashion editors and publicists. The show was divided into 4 sections of about 20 looks each, beginning with the red, white, and blue ensembles, followed by travel clothes, festival fashions for enjoying America's cultural offerings, and ending with this parade of white evening gowns against a slide of the White House itself. The Blue Room served as the backstage area, crammed with racks of clothes and tables of jewelry and accessories. Here, models had 2 minutes to change before lining up in the Red Room and stepping back out onto the runway. In this case, the color symbolism was coincidence. They happened to be the rooms closest to the state dining room. So brisk was the pace that one model missed her final turn on the runway and could not get on stage until all the models came out at the end to take their bows. The show remains a landmark gathering of American design talent and a rare snapshot of an entire season worth of fashion, from junior sportswear to elite designers. It conveys the look of 1968 better than any fashion magazine could. The ongoing hemline wars were fought on the runway, with minis, maxis, and the newly introduced midi battling for supremacy. For those who just couldn't make up their minds, there were high-low hemline combinations, culottes, and even a couple of pairs of pants. Major springtime trends included girlish floral appliques, polka dots, plaids, vests or sleeveless coats, as some were described, black and white stripes, and for evening, floating chiffons. It was an eclectic mix of youth and maturity, high-end and low-cost, traditional and avant-garde. The New York Times called Rudy Gernrich's ensemble of red and white diaper pants and a black and white top one of the less conservative in the show. It was undoubtedly chosen by committee member Dorothy LeSueur, who had praised the avant-garde collection in the Washington Post a few weeks earlier. This more conventional strapless white organdy dress with embroidered net bolero by Pauline Trégère caught the First Lady's eye. Bess Abel later sent Mrs. Johnson this photo, and notice how it's juxtaposed against the silhouette of the Capitol, with an attached note reading, "I could pursue the possibility of having floor length." Abel told me that Mrs. Johnson always had her evening wear customized, lest someone else arrive at a White House party in the same gown as the hired help, as she called herself. But the First Lady apparently had a change of heart, responding, "Never mind." The sample survives in the Kent State Museum collection. This gray Adolf Zelenka suit paired with a pussycat bow and brown polka dots may look like office attire, but it was actually from the juniors department. The linen look rayon was a budget alternative to the real thing. By the late 1960s, many designers and department stores were exploring so-called boutique lines, trendy and inexpensive clothes aimed at the growing teen market and unlikely to win over the mostly middle-aged women in the White House audience. Today, we would call this fast fashion. This silk culotte ensemble by B.H. Ragg really did discover America in style. In May of 1968, it was featured in an 8-page Vogue advertising supplement for Kodak Instamatic cameras, shot aboard the USS United States. Several of the gowns featured in the show have survived in museum collections, including this Jeffrey Bean piqué midi dress and vest, which Bean himself donated to the Met's Costume Institute. In her fashion show commentary, Nancy White called it an enchanting example of the new length for an evening occasion. White described this violet-strewn midi confection by Chester Weinberg as a dress that celebrates girlishness, sashed with the biggest green taffeta bow of all time. Weinberg is a designer virtually forgotten today, but he was every bit as famous as Bean in 1968. In fact, his clothes would appear on the cover of Vogue in both March and April of that year. Bill Blass had 5 ensembles in the show, the most of any designer. The highly Instagrammable daisy-trimmed vinyl raincoat he designed for Bond Street, priced at $200 on the left, had just appeared in Vogue when the show took place in the center. A few weeks later, it would star in a fashion spread in the Saturday Evening Post on the right. Another Blass look, a cream windowpane check wool coat lined in brown silk and worn over a matching brown silk dress, was belted with metal links at one side. In her remarks, Nancy White declared it a handsome way to visit a new town. This James Gallino satin evening shirt dress in the Kent State Museum is similar to the ribbed wool version that appeared on the runway in the grand finale, at the far right of the black and white photo. Alongside this cotton lace coat dress by Samuel Winston, now missing its belt in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which Nancy White hailed as sheer femininity from top to toe. It was a clear audience favorite and can be seen second from left in the photo. Instead of a bridal gown, the show ended with this red, white, and blue chiffon number by Sarmi of New York, now in a private collection. It brought the show to a rousingly patriotic conclusion after the parade of white evening gowns. Not all the runway looks were a hit, however. The Associated Press noted that the political wives were noticeably cool to those miniskirts displayed. They saved their biggest applause for long evening gowns emphasizing the feminine look. Mrs. Nelson Rockefeller, the wife of the governor of New York, the home of the American garment industry, told reporters that there were many perfectly heavenly things and it was in excellent taste. But the wife of the Arizona governor delivered a brutal backhanded compliment when she remarked of the trendy new midi length, "That's for me, I'm naturally dowdy." Others remarked that some of the clothes were more suitable for their daughters or granddaughters. But the jaded fashion industry professionals in the audience realized that they were making history that day. Designer Jeannie Campbell of the Sportworld Sportswear Company saved her program, place cards, menu, and other mementos, and she was not the only one to do so. Rudy Gernrich's program is signed by first daughter Linda Johnson Robb, Washington Post fashion editor Nina Hyde, China Machado, and the rest of his table mates. And you can see that Linda wrote Linda J and then remembered she had a new name and wrote Robb. Model Denise Lendon, the second from the left in this photo, took home some of the Discover America flags as souvenirs for her children. "Just think of the history books and all that has taken place in the White House," she said later. "And there I am having fittings in Lincoln's bedroom." John Simonelli, who designed this white coat dress, was equally starstruck, remarking, "Imagine sitting in the White House watching my clothes on a runway." Model Sherry Thomas on the left framed the White House matchbook she grabbed as a souvenir. She also took home one of the Discover America scarves, but her agency made her give it back, something she deeply regrets today. But all the models did receive a photo of themselves modeling in the show, signed with a note from the First Lady. This one belongs to Linda Hatch, who you can see in the center just to the right of the model in the bubblegum pink gown. In his thank you note to Mrs. Johnson, designer Chester Weinberg summed up the feelings of many of the participants. "For me, this was a great moment in my life. For fashion, this was a great moment, truly an important one. You have given American designers a new dignity." Nancy White called it nothing less than one of the greatest things that ever happened to American fashion. The First Lady, in turn, sent her thanks to the organizing committee, writing to Eleni Epstein, Now that the runway has disappeared from the dining room, the models have gone, and the last bobby pin has been swept up from the Blue Room, it hardly seems possible that last week we had an exciting fashion show here at the White House. Nobody knows exactly why a fashion show has never been held at the White House before, Pittsburgh Press noted at the time. But I would like to suggest to you a few possible reasons why it never happened again. For all their careful planning, Mrs. Johnson's staff did not anticipate how dangerous mixing fashion and politics could be. As soon as the show was announced, telegrams like this one poured in from around the country, from people lobbying for a role in the event. The executive director of California Fashion Creators urged the organizers to include California designers. A Boston modeling agency offered to donate the services and travel expenses of a local model, pointing out, Boston is the birthplace of our great nation. In the aftermath of the show, another flurry of telegrams arrived. Designers from DC to Dallas complained that they had been left out. The president of the Philadelphia Convention and Tourist Bureau protested that there were not enough images of his city in the slideshow. And though it had taken Nancy Dickerson, Beth Abel, and assorted fashion industry professionals years to convince Mrs. Johnson to host the show, it finally happened at the worst possible time, midway through the Tet Offensive. On February 18th, just days before the show, the Pentagon had announced the Vietnam War's highest weekly death toll, 543 American soldiers lost. An angrily scrawled letter to Mrs. Johnson preserved in the LBJ library reads, "Have you given up highway beautification for fashion shows? How much longer do you all in the White House expect to insult our hardcore servicemen, both in Vietnam and those poor suckers imprisoned in Korea? What a disgrace." Model Sherry Thomas remembers that several of the girls were very anti-Vietnam. Many of the models were still in their teens, after all, and at the forefront of the counterculture that was about to shake the nation. Thomas's boyfriend had fought in Vietnam. When President Johnson dropped in on the models as they were rehearsing, one of the models went all the way to the back of the crowd because she didn't want to shake his hand, Thomas recalls. But Thomas pushed her way to the front. "Even if I had felt strongly against the war," she says today, "it was still my president. I put out my hand and he took my hand and he had these big rancher hands. I'll never forget that. And he said, 'It's so nice to see so many pretty girls in the White House.'" When Thomas told me this story, she did it in an absolutely perfect imitation of LBJ's Texas drawl, still fresh in her memory more than 50 years later. Sharon Francis remembers the event in its red, white, and blue color scheme as an attempt to boost morale at a time when many Americans were feeling discouraged by the endless war. But the gesture backfired, and the fashion show ended up being another black mark against the Johnson administration. 1968 has gone down in American history as a year of revolution. So much of what we think happened in the 60s actually happened in 1968. 1968 was also an election year. And just a month after the fashion show on March 31st, President Johnson unexpectedly announced that he would not seek re-election, perhaps stung by slogans like this one advocating ABJ, anyone but Johnson. Republican Richard Nixon would win a narrow victory over Vice President Hubert Humphreys that November, and the rest is history. The final and more philosophical reason why the fashion show experiment was never repeated was inadvertently suggested by Mrs. Orville Freeman, the wife of the Secretary of Agriculture, who said after the show, "It makes you itch to have more of a private life to wear these things. Girls in public life just have to be so careful about what we wear." Fashion and politics have always been a volatile combination, particularly for women who cannot retreat into the sober anonymity of a suit and tie. Elected officials and their families must dress appropriately and buy American without appearing to spend taxpayers' money frivolously. When a first lady patronizes a foreign designer, the press has traditionally treated it as high treason. The CFDA, the organization Eleanor Lambert founded, actually issued a press release criticizing Michelle Obama for wearing a gown by Alexander McQueen, a British designer, to a state dinner. In 1968, apparel was America's fourth largest industry and could not be ignored. But as it declined in the 70s and 80s, the propaganda value of fashion waned, and it became a political liability instead. Nancy Reagan was sharply criticized for buying expensive designer clothes and equally castigated when she accepted them for free. Hillary Clinton was both a serious presidential contender and a pantsuited punchline. Michelle Obama and Melania Trump were alternately hailed as inspirational fashion icons and blasted as free-spending fashion victims. When Mrs. Obama held a fashion-themed event at the White House in October 2014, she was careful to frame it as an education workshop for design students, even though industry luminaries like Zach Posen, Tracy Reese, Philip Lim, Diane von Furstenberg, and Anna Wintour were among the speakers. And while Americans are on track to spend $344 billion on clothes and shoes this year, 97% of American clothing is now manufactured overseas, often in developing nations, in sweatshops plagued by accidents and human rights violations. Perhaps the time has come for fashion to discover America again. Thank you so much. I would like to invite you to buy the book published by Kent State University Press and follow me on social media. And now I'd be happy to take some questions from the chat.
Hi, Kimberly. One thing, and it's an oversight on my part, I was confused about that first film clip. We were not able to hear it. So I don't know if there's a way to go back.
It had some jazzy music, and Lady Bird gave a little inspirational speech. Sorry about that.
And we did drop a link to that in the chat. So
it's on YouTube, so go and watch it. It's the newsreel is called The President, and it's for February 1968. The LBJ Library has put all those newsreels on YouTube for your benefit. I think it's about 12 minutes in.
So my apologies about that. I wondered if you could talk about if you had done any research on in 1965 the White House Festival of the Arts, which didn't seem to happen again either, that the Johnsons hosted, and there was definitely some backlash around that related to the Vietnam War and the artists who participated. Do you think that there was a connection between?
That's a great point. They may have wanted to distance themselves from that a bit, and that's why the fashion show got pushed off until 1968, even though they were talking about it as early as 66. It doesn't really surprise me. And of course, there were many other things happening in the Johnson White House. I mean, he got reelected. There were a lot of foreign trips and events. So I don't know if it was just a victim of circumstance or it was strategic that they put it off so long. But then when they did have it, it ended up being very bad timing.
Can you speak a little bit about Lady Bird and her fashion choices? I know she was a big fan of Adele Simpson. How did her fashion choices compare to like what was in the show? Because you say that there's a lot of differences.
Yeah, there's a chapter in the book about Lady Bird's fashion evolution. She did come into the White House very unprepared for the scrutiny on her wardrobe and a little bit cynical about fashion, but she changed over time, and the fashion show really represents, I think, her changing attitude toward fashion. I also published an article on her specifically in the White House Historical Association's journal last year, which is a fashion-themed issue that if you're interested in First Lady fashion, you definitely want to add to your collection. She ended up making the best dressed list, actually, which was a huge achievement at the time, and one that was probably orchestrated by Eleanor Lambert. And Lady Bird was the first to admit she didn't really deserve it. She kind of got it because she was First Lady. But she had come a long way by that point. She really hated shopping. She would kind of go to New York once or twice a year and kind of do all her shopping at once. But of course, as First Lady, she really needed a bigger wardrobe than that. Johnsons were very frugal. She hated to spend money. She liked to get things on sale. We could all relate to that. But over time, she learned that as First Lady, she actually did need to step it up a bit and really did need to pay attention to what she was wearing and who the designers were. She worked very closely with Neiman Marcus, which was based in Dallas, where she was from. She was a longtime customer of theirs. But of course, we have to point out that much of her taste was dictated by her husband, who had very particular ideas about what women should wear, not just his wife and his daughters, but his staff. And he had banned certain colors, and he really liked bright, cheerful colors. He hated purple, he hated brown, he hated black. He gave his female staffers time off to go to the beauty parlor because he wanted them to have nice hair and makeup. So he was really pulling the strings in a lot of ways. He bought a lot of clothes for his wife and daughters, and anything that Lady Bird bought, he had to approve. He had a very powerful veto in fashion. So when we talk about Lady Bird's taste, we really can't overlook LBJ's taste as well.
That's so interesting. I love this undercurrent of Nancy Dickerson as being like the impetus, but also like you shared with us some images of her fashion. Can you talk a little bit about her? And
Yeah, she's a fascinating character. I think she would be a great book actually, because she was very chic. She was always on the best dressed list. And it's so funny to me that she was the one who said we have to support American fashion, and then she showed up in French couture to the luncheon, and her excuse for that was she was pregnant and she didn't want anyone to know. And Courage made very sort of boxy clothes, so she was kind of trying to hide her pregnancy and also fit into something that maybe was a little more roomy than her normal clothes. So there was a story there, but also she was just extremely chic and very attuned to what French designers were doing as well as Americans.
I'm really curious about the graphic design of some of those place markers and booklets. Do you know
Are they
anything
cute?
about
Yeah.
the illustrator?
I don't. And I would love to know more. I didn't find any credits to that, but as I said, this came about very quickly. So I would assume it was somebody that the White House had used before, or someone in house who did it. But yeah, they're very sweet.
And the gifting, we've already talked a little bit about Frankie Welch. And again, we're going to be hosting a small exhibition of Frankie Welch scarves and fashion here at National First Ladies Historic Site. So stay tuned for that. But I love this idea of the Frankie Welch scarf as a gift and this promotion of America and American design. Did Lady Bird use those scarves throughout the like post fashion show as well?
Well, Frankie Welch actually sent Lady Bird one of those maxi dresses made out of the scarf print, and Lady Bird sent it back. She said, "This is great, but it's a little bit too youthful for me." So she could have had one of those. She sent it back. She did have the scarf and wear the scarf and gave out the scarf. I have a scarf right here. I got this one on eBay, and one of the great things about it that was part of Frankie's intention is that whichever way you wore it or folded it, you would see red, white, and blue. So every corner has red, white, and blue in it. And that was a very deliberate part of the design. And when Gina Machado was called upstairs to put Lady Bird's scarf on her before the show, she said she had to tie it in a way that America would show.
Oh, amazing. And I saw Ashley Callahan is watching live with us. So she's been
Oh,
in
hi,
the
Ashley.
group too. So
Yeah,
it's been
I
fun
want to
to
thank
see
Ashley
her.
for working with me on this project, because she was a great source of images and information about Frankie particularly. We had a lot of fun going back and forth with our favorite Lady Bird fashion pictures.
And so it's fun to see because we had a long conversation about what's available on eBay related to Frankie Welch. So it's fun to see that one of those has shown up on eBay because I've been scouring eBay for Frankie Welch recently. So I'm glad you could share that scarf.
Well, there are a few in museum collections too, and of course the ones that the guests were given were screen printed. This is silk. This is one of the mass produced ones, and they didn't have time to mass produce them in silk in time for the show. So the ones they got were actually they look like they were painted cotton. They weren't as silky as this, and every scarf was at the place setting in an envelope, and it came with a little diagram of how to tie your scarf that Frankie gave out with all her scarves, I think. But it also came with a note saying, this is for today, and we're going to send you the finished version once we have them all printed up. So this is just your temporary scarf that you can wear today. So some of those scarves have actually survived in state archives, for example, because the governor's wife, donated it. So there's a difference between the ones they actually got at the show and then these that were mass produced.
Mhm. I really loved your description, or the description, the woman said naturally dowdy. I will never forget that as a description of that, describing your sense of fashion, along with the youthquake. So let's see, I think we might have one more question. No, I think that's all. What else are you working on now?
Well, the reason I know about the White House Fashion Show at all is because I was researching a book on Chester Weinberg, who was, one of these designers who attended, and that's where I found the interview with him saying, "Oh, and he just came back from Washington, where he was in the White House Fashion Show." I thought, well, that ought to be a footnote in the book. Now that's a book, and I'm still working on Chester Weinberg, so hopefully that will be my next published book.
Do you think there'll ever be another White House fashion show?
I would love to see one. I think the White House probably has other priorities. But I do love that Michelle Obama brought fashion back into the White House. She also did a similar event for the film industry. So it wasn't just fashion, it was kind of part of a series of educational art themed events at the White House. And I think that was a very smart way to do it, because it made it part of the larger art scene, and also something that was really for students rather than for privileged politicians' wives. Something that was not as maybe theatrical as a fashion show, but did bring a lot of fashion talent to the White House and gave them a spotlight, because fashion is still a huge industry. And now in 1968, 5% of American clothing was manufactured overseas, and that's reversed. It's now 3% is manufactured in America. So it's a very appropriate time to highlight the problems that have arisen from that, and also to bring attention to designers who are trying hard to bring manufacturing and bring those skills and industries back to U.S. soil.
Well, I think that's a great way to leave it. Dr. Kimberly Chrisman-Campbell, thank you so much for joining us. And again, we want to encourage people to purchase the book. It's from Kent State University Press, about the 1968 White House Fashion Show and the politics of American style. So thank you so much for joining us for today's legacy lecture. And if you didn't get a chance to see the whole thing, we will be sending out a link. And stay tuned for an update about next month's. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.